Hello, everyone. Thank you for viewing the second part to the ePortfolio workshop series. So this is going to be part 2 of 4. I'm Lindsay. I'm the academic advisor for Knights of Distinction.
And I'm Kara. I'm the ePortfolio specialist and graduate assistant.
The first thing we're going to talk about today are the 3 key points that you want to keep in mind when you're writing your reflections. So the first thing is to be selective. So last time we talked a little bit about your inventories and plans and how you might have a lot of experiences for each milestone, which is great. But as far as writing the reflections, you're going to want to focus on choosing 1 or 2 of those experiences and really going into detail about your skill development and how you were able to apply those skills in different situations.
And then you want to discuss those skills and think about what parts of those experiences are going to best showcase your skill. So it's good to give us a little bit of information about what the experience was, but also to focus in on the parts of that experience that were really relevant and that illustrate what you gained from that experience.
And I think the other part of the discussion aspect is to talk about this with your, with peers that are in your major, with your professors, maybe with your advisors. Get their feedback on what are the most relevant experiences for your audience. So again, always keeping audience in mind. Is it future employers, graduate schools? And that will help you choose relevant experiences to talk about for each reflection as well. And then for evidence, so evidence is going to be really where you explain, you give specific examples of your skill development. So for example, if you're talking about, you're doing a reflection on leadership and say you were treasurer for an on-campus organization or one of the RSOs. So you'll start the reflection by talking about developing your leadership style, what the role was within that experience, and then you'll go on to really talking about the development of skills, what kind of leadership skills did you learn, and giving specific examples of how you were able to apply those skills and maybe even transfer them to different situations beyond just that experience.
So you want to consider the following when you're looking at your reflections. Like Lindsay said, you want to think about the experiences that best reflect the skills that you want to illustrate and that are going to be most interesting to your specific audience. So sometimes this can get confusing or it can be hard with milestones like planning and self-assessment or citizenship, where a lot of your experiences are like meeting with your career advisor or meeting with or going to campus events like Spirit Splash or sports events. And those things aren't necessarily things that you would want to include on your ePortfolio because they don't necessarily demonstrate skills that your audience wants to see, but you could talk about the idea of being goal-oriented and bring that from your planning and self-assessment experiences. And you can also, with citizenship, talk about the importance of involvement in professional development and talk about some of your other citizenship events, attending lectures and symposiums where you're learning something, even if it's outside of your field.
Okay, so we talked a lot about audience in the first workshop session. And again, just to reiterate, you are choosing your audience. It's whoever you want it to be. It should be focused on whatever you want to do after you graduate from UCF. So whether that's future employers, graduate schools, maybe seeking out internships or fellowships, those are all options you can consider. The audience is not Knights of Distinction. So it's not me, it's not Kara. Even though we're evaluating the reflections, it's all of the feedback is geared towards the audience that you're intending this for. So it should be outward facing. The last bullet point on here is application. So this is where you really focus in on applying your skills to those different situations we talked about. One, I think, strategic way to do this is to talk about an experience from a different milestone. So sometimes you can, if you want to, you can reference, even if you're doing a leadership reflection, you can reference an experience that you had in, say, Knights in the World or high impact learning, and just talk about how you were able to transfer those skills to that experience or that situation to help you succeed, or maybe overcome challenges.
So your areas of focus can be kind of the trickiest part of developing your ePortfolio, because they're going to be different for everyone, and there's no formula to really help you decide what works the best for your ePortfolio. You kind of have to take a look at your audience, because again, audience is the most important part of this, and you have to decide what themes and what skills that you think are going to be important for your audience. So you can consider topics that your audience would be interested in, like involvement in community service, samples of your writing, things like that. And another way that you can also look at areas of focus is if you don't necessarily know what skills you want to showcase yet, you can also take all of your artifacts and lay them out and look at what themes and recurring patterns are there in those artifacts. And that will kind of help you to organize those artifacts into groups and see what they have in common, and then make those your areas of focus.
So again, here, like Kara said, your areas of focus will be representative of whoever your audience is. So you'll want to think about topics for your areas of focus that your audience would be interested in learning about in relation to your skills. Something to think about here, as far as where we're at within this workshop series now, I think as you're writing your reflections, and you should have 3 or 4 reflections done by the time we get to the 3rd session of the workshop. So something to think about is, as you're going, like Kara said, look for those reoccurring themes in your skill sets, and kind of just have a rough idea of what categories you might sort those into for your areas of focus. You don't have to be too concerned with getting actual content in there. We're going to talk about that in his 2nd year, how to effectively adapt those reflections. But it is useful to just have an idea as you go, even if those areas of focus change in the long run, that's okay. But it gives you something to work with as far as building content for your portfolio.
So in adapting your reflections for your areas of focus, there's a couple of things that you want to think about. When you submit your summative reflections to us, we give you feedback. And even if your reflection is absolutely perfect and gets an 8 out of 8 on the rubric, we still give you feedback, because the reflections that you're writing for the summative assessments are all focused in, they're each focused in one milestone. And in adapting these for your ePortfolio, you're not necessarily going to keep that structure, because you only have 3 areas of focus, and you're not going to have all 5 milestones on your ePortfolio. And you might want to mix and match experiences from different milestones depending on what your areas of focus are going to be. So you can use different parts of different reflections and kind of put them together. And things that you want to think about there are, expanding examples like we've talked about, and providing evidence of the skills that you're saying that you've gained from these experiences. And you also want to think about transitions between those experiences, connecting them by a skill that you've learned from one experience that maybe you used in a different experience, or a challenge that you overcame that help you to gain a skill that is going to be useful in your future career, and making that connection between those things. And also consider your word choice and who your audience is. So how you write your ePortfolio and how you write your reflections is going to be dependent on your voice as an individual, and also who your audience is and what kind of voice that they would want to hear.
Yeah, so picking up on what Kara said, although it is perfectly fine if you want to, when you're adapting this for your ePortfolio, if you want to, use a section from leadership, the leadership reflection, and maybe a section from the Knights in the World reflection, so you can kind of expand, like Kara said, on those experiences. You're going to want to pay attention to your transitions. You're going to have to go back and fix how you introduce the experiences and how you transition from one to the other, and then also adding in the synthesis part. So making sure that you adapt the kind of the value of the skill development and what it means as far as how is it relevant in whatever career you're going to go into or whatever field or discipline, even if that's maybe a graduate program. And then with word choice, so something to keep in mind here is it's fine in the reflections if you want to refer to like the leadership milestone or high impact learning experiences. But when you adapt this for your portfolio, you would not use a phrase such as high impact learning because an outward facing audience wouldn't know what that means. So you want to rephrase some of those words and phrases that are program specific or maybe university specific to different terminology that your audience will be familiar with. Okay, so this is obviously the online recorded portion of this presentation. The original workshop is face-to-face, but I do want to take a minute here to point out some of the materials that were used during the face-to-face session of the workshop, because I think it's valuable, even if you're watching this online, to kind of go through these worksheets and look at what we're asking you to do as far as reflection. So if you click on the reflection feedback hyperlink below, a Word file should open up. And this was the worksheet that we used to do peer reviews. So although you might not have someone to peer review this or someone else in the program to peer review it, it is still valuable and you can still pay attention to the questions that we're asking. So asking you to identify the milestones that you're writing about, what experiences you talk about in the reflection, skill development. So these are all kind of questions that can help you brainstorm or help you kind of evaluate and revise your own reflection after you write it.
So one of the other resources that we used after we had the students do peer review in the workshop was the self-reflection exercise. So after they received their feedback and went through their reflection with their partner, we had each student do this exercise and answer these questions, which you can also do for your reflection to help you think about the things that you want to include in your reflections. So again, with this resource, you want to pay attention to the questions we're asking because we're asking these questions so that if you don't have an answer for what skills you've included, then that means that you haven't answered that part of the reflection. And so that's something that you want to go back and revise. So just work your way through the questions. Even if you don't write them down, this is a great way to kind of double check and make sure that you are hitting exactly what you need to hit with the reflections.
And we'll take a moment to clarify here. So although on your initial inventories, as you know, you're listing like dates and things like that for your reflections, you do not need to be concerned with listing what dates you engaged in something. Your audience, that's not something that they're going to be looking at. They'll look at your resume for that. But it is useful to think of kind of time frames, especially if you're talking about two experiences within one reflection. So you can think about like when the first one occurred and when the second one occurred and kind of relate your skill development accordingly. So what skills from the first experience helped you be successful in the second experience? Okay, so another thing to keep in mind is on the worksheet, you'll notice that several of the questions refer to like giving examples of specific tasks and projects where you found the skills useful and kind of explaining. That is something you'll definitely want to do for these reflections, but don't feel like you have to do that for every single experience. So for example, if you're writing, a reflection on leadership and you're giving a specific example of maybe how you developed your leadership style, maybe you save another example for explaining how this was transferable for another reflection, or maybe you do this more as synthesis when you get to your ePortfolio. So your reflections, try to keep them within that 350 to 500 word count. If you're using examples for every single situation that you describe, it's going to get way too long. So you just want to be selective in the examples that you're choosing to include. The third document that you'll see is the sample summative reflection for leadership. So for this, we had everyone kind of read through the sample reflection and look at what worked here, what didn't work. Kara and I are going to take a minute here to kind of discuss some of those so that you have an idea of maybe how you could use this or use some of these strategies and techniques for your own reflections. After reading this reflection through, you'll notice that the student chose to focus on two experiences from leadership. So the first one is the John T. Washington Honor Society executive board member, and then the other one was the Night Watch Peer Mentor Program. So for the executive board member for the Washington Honor Society, the student talks a little bit about coordinating with SGA and the student union, doing fundraising, working with new members. But I think what's interesting here is when she focuses on becoming more of an active listener. So this is where she's starting to target a skill that her audience would want to learn more about. You'll notice after reading this through, the last couple of sentences, she talks about being a physician or wanting to be a physician in the future. So becoming an active listener is relating to working with patients, working with different audiences, and having to kind of manage that difference between listening to what people are telling you and expressing empathy, and then being able to apply that to her different situations.
And with the Night Watch Peer Mentor Program, the student also talks about mentoring students and having to learn to be flexible with them and provide mentorship in a way that worked for each individual student. And I really liked that the student showed examples of these skills that she was developing. Although with the Night Watch Peer Mentor Program, she doesn't necessarily name those skills like she did with the Honor Society. So that was a suggestion that we would have made, is to name the skills of adaptability and flexibility. And a lot of students in the workshop pointed that out as well. And also between the two paragraphs, her first two paragraphs, even though the experiences she's having were very similar in that she was working with students and kind of in a mentorship role, she doesn't necessarily connect those two until you get to the very end of the reflection. So she could have had a transition between those two paragraphs that would have made a connection between those experiences and would have really strengthened that as well.
And I think some of the things she did well with the discussion of the Night Watch Peer Mentor Program is where she focuses on different outreach efforts for students. So she's in this peer mentorship role, and she kind of takes it upon herself to keep in contact with them. She mentions via text, email. So something we talked about in the face-to-face session is that appropriate to say in a reflection, like you were keeping in contact via text? Is that significant? And I think the answer ended up being it is significant, because within how the Night Watch Peer Mentor Program works, that's how their peer mentors are encouraged to interact and keep up with the people that they're mentoring. But a little more explanation of the value of that could have been incorporated here to make that a little bit clearer for an outside audience who might not understand the significance of that.
Something else we also said in this reflection is that she does relate the skills that she's developed to her goal of being a physician's assistant at the very end of the reflection. But because she doesn't say that anywhere else in the reflection, it comes as almost like a surprise, which in the context of the ePortfolio, she would have probably said earlier on in her About Me or on her homepage that that was her goal. But that would have been a suggestion we made with the reflection, is that we want to know up front what her goal is so that we know how to read this reflection and how to look at these skills that she's developed and why they're important to her career field.
And that would be something that her audience would want to be able to quickly identify as well. I think it is worth mentioning, so this specific example was a second iteration of a reflection. So the student submitted it, we gave some feedback, they revised it, and we reviewed it again and gave a little bit more feedback, and then it was adapted for the ePortfolio. So some of these improvements or areas for revision we've talked about were ultimately addressed in the final ePortfolio version. But I think it's worth thinking about as far as what you're doing with the reflections and how you're creating them. It's better to draft them up, submit them, get some feedback, give yourself time to revise. Most students, will need to go through 2 or 3 iterations before they adapt it for their portfolio to make it the best that it can be.
Because even with this reflection, even though it is a second iteration, there were still things that we found in it that could be strengthened. So just also know that it does take time to really nail these reflections and to be able to successfully adapt them for the ePortfolio. Because even once they're in your ePortfolio, we'll still be giving you more feedback. So it just takes time and it takes a lot of practice to get exactly what you want for your audience.
I think another thing that we talked about in the workshop was, how much you should focus on things like, syntax, your sentence structure, grammar, things like that. And of course, you don't want it, for grammar errors to make it so that it's your audience is unable to understand what you're saying. But for things like that, focus more on content first. If you're not as great of a writer, there are resources on campus that can help you with that. We've got the Writing Center on campus. You can take drafts of these there to help fix word choice, grammar and syntax errors, or issues that you might be concerned with. And you can schedule a meeting with me and Kara as well, if you'd like us to take kind of a closer look at the reflections. And we will point some, if anything is preventing the audience from understanding what you're saying, we'll give you feedback on that. We'll mention that you need to reword or reorganize the structure, things like that. Will be included in the feedback you receive from us. All right, so the next session is going to be on March 20th, and we'll be recording that as well. So look for that the week after. We'll try to post the video. For the next session, the students that are attending face-to-face will be making sure that they have their 3 areas of focus pages set up in their ePortfolio. You don't need to worry about content yet. So the content is going to be adapted from the reflections, but just have your structure set up for your home, About Me, resume, and your areas of focus pages, so you kind of have something to work with as far as that goes. And then you're also going to be bringing in 2 more milestone reflections. So obviously you guys won't need to worry about bringing hard copies, but if you're doing this online and you'd like us to take a look at your drafts, just let us know. You can submit those to the milestone assignment pages, and Kara and I will take a look at them and give you some feedback. And you can always email us if you have any more questions. Thank you guys for viewing the presentation. And like I mentioned, you can always contact us if you have any questions, or if you'd like any more specific feedback on your reflections or on developing your ePortfolio. We'll see you next time.